You know what's weird? Everyone studies boomers like they're some kind of real estate cult. Everyone roasts millennials like they're broke philosophers with Starbucks addictions. Everyone watches Gen Z like they're trying to turn breathing into a side hustle. But there's one generation nobody talks about. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. They're the ones who quietly build wealth while acting like they're one paycheck away from disaster. They have $70,000 in savings, but they drive a Toyota that sounds like it's powered by duct tape and unresolved trauma. They'll drop $600 on concert tickets, then argue with a cashier over a 40-cent coupon. And here's the truth. Gen X doesn't have money habits. Gen X has money scars, because they grew up watching the system promise stability and then explode. They're the first generation that learned this lesson early. Hard work does not guarantee security. And they didn't learn it from social media. They learned it by watching their parents get wiped out. Picture the world Gen X was raised in. It's the 1980s. Your dad has one job at one company. He's been there 15 years. He expects to be there 15 more. He has a pension, a mortgage that makes sense, a savings account that actually pays interest. Back then, banks paid interest like they were apologizing for existing. The world felt predictable. Work hard, save, retire. That was the deal. Then Gen X grew up, and the system basically said, yeah, about that deal, we lied. Fast forward to 2008. Gen X is now in their late 20s to early 40s. They did everything right. They went to college, they got jobs, they contributed to their 401k, they bought houses. Then suddenly, the stock market collapses, home values crater, people lose jobs overnight, retirement accounts get cut in half, and Gen X watched companies lay off people who had been loyal for 20 years like it was nothing, like human beings were printer paper. That moment rewired their brains, because that's when Gen X learned the real rule of money. The system can change the rules whenever it wants. So Gen X didn't become bad with money. They became defensive. They became paranoid. And honestly, they're not crazy. They're experienced. Here's the first weird Gen X trait. They're simultaneously the most anxious about retirement and the most consistent savers. According to the 2023 Trans-America Center for Retirement Studies, 70% of Gen X says they're terrified about retirement, but they also have some of the highest retirement contribution rates. They don't believe the system will work, but they still fund it anyway. That's not optimism, that's trauma budgeting. Psychologists call this defensive pessimism. You assume everything will go wrong, so you prepare obsessively. Gen X doesn't save because they're disciplined. They save because they expect life to punch them in the mouth, and life already has. Everyone thinks side hustles are a Gen Z thing. They're wrong. Gen X was doing side hustles before side hustles had a name. Federal Reserve data shows Gen X has higher rates of self-employment and secondary income streams than both boomers and millennials. But here's the difference. Gen Z builds side hustles because they want freedom. Gen X builds side hustles because they don't trust their employer. They're not chasing passion, they're building escape tunnels. They keep the day job, but quietly build an Etsy shop, a consulting gig, a rental property, something on the side. Not because they love entrepreneurship, because they watched people get laid off at 50 with no warning and no safety net. That image burned into their brains forever. Never depend on one paycheck. Not because you're ambitious, because you're terrified. Here's something that confuses marketers. Gen X will quit a job instantly, but they're weirdly loyal to brands. An Adobe study found Gen X is 34% more likely than millennials to stick with brands from their youth, even when cheaper options exist. They'll leave a Fortune 500 company by email, but they'll drive across town for the same coffee shop. They don't trust institutions, they trust what survived. Corporations betrayed them, banks betrayed them, retirement systems betrayed them, but the brands they've used since high school still work. Gen X doesn't gamble on new things. They already saw what happens when you gamble on the system. Now here's the real paradox. Gen X is cheap with stuff,
but rich with experiences. They'll refuse to buy a new car, but spend thousands on concerts, travel, and events. Eventbrite found Gen X spends about $3,000 a year on concerts, travel, and live experiences, more than any other generation in actual dollars. Why? Because Gen X learned that stuff is fragile. Markets crash, cars depreciate, houses go underwater, but experiences can't be repossessed. No one can take the memories from you. That trip you took, that concert you saw, that night you lived, those are assets the bank can't touch. So Gen X saves obsessively and spends selectively. They figured out that in an unstable economy, experiences have better return on investment than things. Gen X also has a complicated relationship with financial advisors. Cerulli Associates data shows they're the least likely generation to use traditional advisors. They'd rather manage everything themselves, but they're also the most anxious about making mistakes. They don't trust advisors, but they don't fully trust themselves either. Gen X grew up when you could actually learn things from books and figure stuff out. They believe self-education is real, so they read, they research, they build spreadsheets, they double-check everything, because they watch their parents trust experts and still lose pensions. It's not arrogance, it's self-defense. Here's a stat that shocks people. Gen X carries the highest total debt of any generation, but they're also the most strategic with it. They'll take a $400,000 mortgage but refuse to carry a $2,000 credit card balance, because a mortgage is predictable. Fixed payment, clear timeline, known outcome. Credit card debt is chaos. It never ends. And Gen X watched consumer debt swallow people alive in the 80s and 90s. So the lesson wasn't never borrow. It was only borrow what you can map to completion. Debt for an asset, maybe. Debt for a business move, possibly. Debt for a couch or a vacation? Absolutely not. One last thing that looks old-fashioned but is actually genius. Gen X keeps paper records. AARP found 61% of Gen X maintains physical files for important documents, compared to only 34% of millennials. They're not bad with technology. They built the internet. They just remember systems crashing, records disappearing, and digital promises evaporating. They trust technology to work most of the time. They trust paper to work all of the time. Digital banking app, yes. Paper statements, also yes. Cloud storage, sure. Fireproof safe, obviously. It's redundancy by design, because they've lived through multiple system failures. So here's what Gen X money psychology really tells us. They're not confused, they're not contradictory, they're adapted. They adapted to an economy that promised stability and delivered chaos. They trust nothing, they prepare for everything. They still show up, because what else are you going to do? Gen X learned that hard work equals security. They just also learned the system can rewrite the rules whenever it wants. So they play the game, but they never forget. The game is rigged. If you're Gen X, you're not paranoid, you're awake. And if you're younger watching this, pay attention, because Gen X isn't stuck in the past. They're living proof the system doesn't care about your plans. Stop buying traps, start building kings. That is the logic. Subscribe for more.